The most accurate prediction of American political collapse in the modern era was made by a man who studies pine beetles, not a political scientist, not an economist, not an intelligence analyst, a professor of ecology at the University of Connecticut who spent his career modeling why insect populations boom and crash. But that is not the unsettling part. The unsettling part is that he published it in 2010 in Nature with a date attached. He said the crisis would peak around 2020. He used the same differential equations that ecologists use to model predator-prey dynamics in lemmings and bark beetles. And every single variable he identified moved exactly where he said it would, exactly when he said it would. The people whose job it was to see this coming did not see it coming. He did, and he did it with math borrowed from entomology. Tonight, I want to walk you slowly and carefully through a one-paragraph letter buried in Nature for a decade. The predator-prey equations that treat elites and commoners like wolves and rabbits, a Soviet dissident father who was exiled alongside Sakharov, a stress curve that matches the run-up to the American Civil War almost perfectly, and a database of 168 civilizational crises spanning 10,000 years that tells you with cold numerical clarity what comes next. Settle in and get comfortable. If you are not subscribed, now is the time. And if you want more of this kind of deep, slow, uncomfortable research across history, physics, and collapse, that is what Patreon is for. Stay for this one, because the model that got the 20s right says the structural pressures have not peaked, and the historical odds it calculated are not numbers you forget easily. Let's start where it started. In February of 2010, buried in the correspondence section of Nature, volume 463, page 608, a man who had spent 2 decades counting dead pine beetles published a single paragraph predicting the destabilization of the United States of America. He gave a date. He said the crisis would peak around 2020. He named the variables: stagnating real wages, a growing gap between rich and poor, an explosion of young graduates with advanced degrees and nowhere to put them, public debt spiraling out of control. And then he wrote a sentence that should have triggered a national emergency. He wrote that these seemingly disparate social indicators are actually related to each other dynamically, that they had all experienced turning points during the 1970s, and that historically, when these variables align in this configuration, what follows is political instability on a scale that reshapes nations. Nobody read it. That is not an exaggeration. The letter was a single paragraph of correspondence in a scientific journal responding to a feature called 2020 Visions about the future of research. It was not a research article. It was not peer-reviewed in the traditional sense. It sat in Nature for 10 years, gathering dust while every single variable the author identified moved in exactly the direction he said it would move, at exactly the speed he said it would accelerate. His name is Peter Turchin. At the time he wrote that paragraph, he was a professor of ecology and evolutionary biology at the University of Connecticut in Storrs. His academic reputation had been built on something that sounds absurd in this context: population dynamics of bark beetles. Specifically, a 1991 paper titled "Why Do Populations of Southern Pine Beetles Fluctuate?" published in Environmental Entomology, in which he analyzed 50 years of outbreak data for Dendroctonus frontalis, a species of beetle that periodically devastates pine forests across the American South. He had spent years developing mathematical models for why those beetle populations do not grow steadily, do not plateau neatly, do not follow any simple trend. They oscillate. They boom, overshoot their food supply, crash, recover, and boom again, following a pattern driven by delayed, density-dependent feedback loops between the beetles and the predator species that feed on them. And sometime in the late 1990s, sitting with those equations at his desk in Storrs, Connecticut, Peter Turchin did something that would alienate him from two academic disciplines simultaneously. He looked at the math describing predator-prey population crashes in insects and asked whether human civilizations do the same thing. The answer, according to his model, was yes. And the model did not just describe civilizations in the abstract. It described America, specifically, with numbers and a date. I need to tell you now, before we go any further, that Turchin did not just predict the crisis. That part of the story has already been told, mostly by a single Atlantic article in December of 2020 that made him briefly famous. What has not been told, what I spent an unreasonable amount of time reading about before writing this, is what Turchin built after the prediction. Because predicting that things would get bad was the easy part. The hard part was building a database of 168 societal crises spanning 10,000 years of recorded history, coding them all against the same structural variables and running the numbers on what happens after the crisis starts. He did that. The results are published. And I am not going to tell you what they found yet, because when I do, you are going to need every piece of context I can give you to absorb the implications. So here is where we start. Not with the prediction, not with the math, with the fact that this man's work sits in the open, in journals, in books published by Princeton University Press, endorsed by Jared Diamond, Niall Ferguson, the Nobel laureate Angus Deaton, and Jonathan Haidt. It is not classified. It is not fringe. And the fact that you have almost certainly never heard of structural demographic theory, despite the fact that it produced the most specific and most accurate medium-range forecast of American political instability in the modern era, should tell you something about how our institutions handle information they would rather not absorb. This is a story about a man who tried to turn history into a science, who used the same mathematics that predicts population crashes in lemmings and bark beetles to predict the trajectory of civilizations, who published his prediction in the most prestigious scientific journal on the planet, got it right, and was called the Mad Prophet of Connecticut for his trouble. And it is a story about what his model says is coming next, because the variable curves that peaked around 2020 have not come back down. They are still climbing. And the historical database he built to test the theory, the one I mentioned a moment ago, the one covering 10,000 years, it has a very specific answer to the question of what happens when those curves keep climbing. That answer has been sitting in the literature for years, and the people with the power to act on it are not acting on it. Not because they have examined the evidence and found it wanting, but because the evidence comes from the wrong discipline, built by the wrong kind of scientist, using the wrong kind of math, the math of biology, the math of populations that boom and crash. And when you apply that math to a civilization, the places it takes you are places that nobody in a position of authority wants to go. Let me take you through how we got here. Because the biography matters, not as background color. The biography is load-bearing. The personal history of Peter Turchin is not a separate story from the mathematics. It is the same story, running in both directions. Peter Valentinovich Turchin was born on May 22, 1957, in Obninsk, a Soviet science city about 100 kilometers south of Moscow. If that name does not mean anything to you, it should. Obninsk was one of the closed cities, built specifically to house the researchers working on the Soviet nuclear program and other classified scientific projects. Growing up in Obninsk meant growing up inside the machinery of state-sponsored science. It meant understanding from childhood that knowledge was not neutral, that what you were allowed to study, what you were allowed to publish, what you were allowed to think out loud, was governed by institutional power, not by what was true. His father was a man named Valentin Fyodorovich Turchin. This is the part of the biography that makes the entire Turchin story feel like a script someone wrote as a parable about the relationship between scientists and the states they inhabit. Valentin Turchin was a theoretical physicist at the Keldysh Institute of Applied Mathematics. He invented the Refal programming language, which is still used in certain formal language processing applications. He developed a theory called the metasystem transition, a framework for understanding how complex systems emerge from simpler ones. And in 1968, the year Soviet tanks rolled into Czechoslovakia to crush the Prague Spring, Valentin Turchin did something that would destroy his career and upend his family's life. He co-signed an open letter with Andrei Sakharov and Roy Medvedev, addressed to the Soviet leadership, calling for democratic reform and the liberalization of Soviet society. Think about what that means. In 1968, in the Soviet Union, an open letter to the Politburo signed with your real name saying the system is failing and needs to change. The consequences were exactly what you would expect. Valentin lost his position at the Keldysh Institute. In 1973, he founded the Moscow chapter of Amnesty International. The KGB responded with systematic persecution, surveillance, harassment, professional blacklisting. In 1977, when Peter was 20 years old, the family was forced into exile. Valentin took a position at the City College of New York. Peter transferred his education to New York University, where he completed a bachelor's degree cum laude in 1980, and then went on to Duke University for a PhD in zoology, which he received in 1985. I am telling you this not because it is interesting background. I am telling you because of the irony at the center of this story, an irony so precise, it feels engineered. A man whose father was expelled from the Soviet Union for predicting the moral bankruptcy of a totalitarian state, spent his own career in America building a mathematical model that predicts the disintegration of American democracy. Valentin Turchin saw the structural failures of the Soviet system, named them publicly, and was punished for it. Peter Turchin saw the structural failures of the American system, named them publicly, and was ignored. The father was treated as a dissident. The son was treated as a crank. And the pattern of institutions refusing to hear the people who correctly diagnose their failures, that pattern turns out to be one of the central predictions of the model itself. Valentin Turchin died in 2010, the same year his son published the Nature letter predicting American instability. I have not been able to find a single interview where Peter discusses whether his father saw the letter before he died, or what he thought of it. That absence itself feels significant. So here is Peter Turchin in the late 1980s and early 1990s, a freshly minted PhD from Duke, building his career at the University of Connecticut, studying population dynamics, not human population dynamics, pine beetles specifically. Southern pine beetles, Dendroctonus frontalis, a tiny insect about the size of a grain of rice that periodically devastates millions of acres of pine forest from Texas to Virginia. The outbreaks come in waves. They build over years, peak catastrophically, collapse, and then rebuild. And the question that Turchin spent years on was, why? The conventional answer at the time leaned heavily on external forcing, climate fluctuations, drought stress on the trees making them more vulnerable, weather patterns creating conditions favorable for beetle reproduction. The explanation was essentially that the outbreaks were driven from outside the system, random shocks producing random responses. Turchin looked at 50 years of outbreak data and said that explanation was wrong. Not completely wrong, but fundamentally incomplete. The outbreaks were not random responses to external shocks. They were endogenous oscillations. They were generated by the internal dynamics of the system itself. The beetles, their host trees, and the natural predators that feed on the beetles formed a coupled system, a set of populations linked by density-dependent feedback loops. When beetle populations were low, the trees were healthy and predators were few. This created conditions for explosive beetle growth. The beetles would boom, overrun the available food supply, devastate the forest. But as beetle numbers soared, their predator populations grew too, on a delay, and then the predators would catch up. Beetle numbers would crash, and the cycle would begin again. The mathematical framework Turchin used to describe this is called the Lotka-Volterra system, named after Alfred Lotka and Vito Volterra, who independently derived the equations in the 1920s. In its simplest form, the Lotka-Volterra model describes two populations, a predator and a prey, linked by differential equations that produce sustained oscillations. Prey grow, predators follow, predators overshoot, prey crash, predators crash, prey recover, and the whole thing starts over. The key insight is that the oscillations are not caused by anything external. They are a mathematical consequence of the way the two populations interact. The boom-bust cycle is built into the structure of the system. Turchin's contribution to ecology was demonstrating that real populations, not just theoretical ones, follow these dynamics. His 2003 book, Complex Population Dynamics, a theoretical empirical synthesis, published by Princeton University Press in the Monographs in Population Biology series, became a standard reference. He worked through case studies including the large bud moth in Switzerland, the southern pine beetle in the southeastern United States, red grouse in Scotland, voles and lemmings in Scandinavia, snowshoe hares in Canada, and ungulate populations in the Sahel. Case after case, the same pattern: endogenous oscillations driven by nonlinear feedbacks, populations that appear to behave chaotically from inside the system, but follow predictable dynamics when viewed from above. Robert May, who was at the time president of the Royal Society and one of the most influential theoretical biologists in the world, praised the book for showing that ecological problems can be illuminated by mathematical models. The book was not controversial within ecology. It was rigorous. It was exhaustive. It demonstrated mastery of both the mathematics and the empirical data. By 2004, Turchin was designated a highly cited researcher by the Institute for Scientific Information, a recognition given to scientists whose work is in the top 1% of citation rates in their field. He was elected a Fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science in 2021. This is not a marginal figure. This is someone who built a distinguished, mainstream career in one of the most mathematically rigorous branches of biology, and who then took the tools of that career and pointed them in a direction that nobody in the field had considered. And this is important to understand, because the most common dismissal of Turchin's historical work is that he is not a historian. This is true. He is not a historian. He is a mathematical biologist, and the implication of the dismissal is that this makes him unqualified to make claims about history. But consider the reverse framing. If a historian had invented a mathematical model and applied it to pine beetle populations, Ecologists would not dismiss the work by saying, "You are not a biologist." They would look at the model, estimate the parameters, test the predictions against field data, and publish a response showing either that the model works or that it does not. The dismissal would be empirical, not credential-based. The fact that the response to Turchin's historical work has been overwhelmingly credential-based rather than empirical is itself one of the most important data points in the story. It tells you that the institutional structures governing knowledge production are not optimized for truth-seeking. They are optimized for boundary maintenance. And boundary maintenance is one of the things that Turchin's model predicts will increase during the disintegrative phase of a secular cycle. As institutions under stress retreat into defensive postures rather than engaging with novel information. And then came the pivot. Turchin has told this story in various interviews. Sometime in the late 1990s, the question shifted. He was sitting with the Lotka-Volterra equations, looking at the oscillation curves for predator-prey dynamics in ecological systems, and he began to wonder whether the same mathematical structures could describe the rise and fall of human civilizations. Not as a metaphor, not as a loose analogy, as a formal mathematical model with testable predictions. The idea was not entirely new. It had a predecessor. A political scientist named Jack Goldstone at George Mason University had published a book in 1991 called Revolution and Rebellion in the Early Modern World, in which he argued that the English Civil War, the French Wars of Religion, the Ottoman 17th century crisis, and the Ming-Qing transition in China all shared a common structural cause. Rapid population growth leading to a youth bulge, elite competition for a fixed number of positions, and state fiscal crisis. Goldstone called this demographic structural theory, but Goldstone was a political scientist, not a mathematician. He presented the theory verbally as a historical argument, not as a set of equations. I want to pause on Goldstone for a moment, because his role in this story is essential and underappreciated. Goldstone's 1991 book is one of the most remarkable works of comparative historical analysis published in the 20th century. He took 4 revolutions that had previously been studied as separate events by separate specialists, the English, French, Ottoman, and Chinese cases, and showed that underneath the surface, differences of culture, religion, language, and political system, the same structural dynamics were operating. Population pressure, driving down wages, elite proliferation, driving up competition for positions, state fiscal collapse undermining the government's capacity to mediate. The same 3 variables decades before Turchin formalized them into equations. But Goldstone wrote the book as a political scientist, in the narrative tradition of comparative historical analysis. He presented evidence, made arguments, drew connections. He did not write equations. He did not build a mathematical model that could generate quantitative predictions. And this is the crucial gap that Turchin filled. What Turchin did was take Goldstone's verbal insight and translate it into the language of dynamical systems theory. He made the theory testable. He made it predictive. He gave it the capacity to generate specific, falsifiable forecasts. Goldstone and Turchin have been collaborators ever since. In September of 2020, they co-authored an essay in Noema magazine titled Welcome to the Turbulent Twenties, in which they laid out the structural demographic case that the period from 2020 through the late 2020s would be characterized by escalating political instability in the United States and Western Europe. The essay was published 9 months after COVID hit and 4 months before January 6th. And in 2025, Goldstone told an interviewer that the very same models that explain the French Revolution and the Arab Spring also explain what he called the MAGA revolution currently underway in the United States. When two scholars who have been working independently and collaboratively on the same framework for over 20 years both describe the current American political situation using the word revolution, and when. Their framework is the only one that predicted the timing and character of the current crisis, a decade in advance. The appropriate response is not to profile them in magazines. The appropriate response is to take their model seriously as a diagnostic tool and ask what it says about interventions. But that is not what happened. What Turchin did was formalize it. He took Goldstone's verbal framework and turned it into a mathematical model. And the mathematical language he used, the language he had spent 20 years developing and refining, was the language of population biology, the language of Lotka-Volterra, the language of predators and prey. I need to pause here and explain why this pivot matters, because what Turchin did next is the thing that makes him either one of the most important social scientists of the 21st century or one of the most dangerous cranks in academia, depending on who you ask. And the fact that the establishment has not been able to decide which one he is, even after his prediction was confirmed by a decade of American political upheaval, tells you something about how poorly equipped our intellectual institutions are to handle genuinely novel ideas that cross disciplinary boundaries. Turchin's first foray into applying population dynamics to human history was a book called Historical Dynamics: Why States Rise and Fall, published by Princeton University Press in 2003. The same year as his ecology magnum opus, Complex Population Dynamics. Think about that timeline. In the same year, the same man published a definitive work on insect population cycles and a book proposing that human empires follow the same kind of mathematical dynamics. The contrast alone should have generated massive attention. It did not. Historical Dynamics sold modestly and was reviewed primarily in interdisciplinary journals that historians do not read and biologists do not subscribe to. It fell into the gap between two disciplines, each of which considered the book to be the other one's problem. In Historical Dynamics, Turchin introduced what he called the demographic fiscal model, or DFM. This is the formal mathematical backbone of everything that came later. The DFM consists of 6 coupled ordinary differential equations linking 3 state variables: population, denoted N, state resources, denoted S, and political instability, denoted W. The equations describe how these 3 quantities evolve over time, feeding back into each other. Population grows logistically toward a carrying capacity K, but that growth is modulated by the level of instability W. When instability is high, mortality increases, birth rates decline, and population growth stalls or reverses. State resources S depend on population size and taxation efficiency, but are drained by instability, which increases military and policing expenditures while reducing the state's ability to collect revenue. And instability W is itself a function of the mismatch between population size and state resources. When the population outgrows the state's capacity to manage it, when too many people are competing for too few resources, and the state cannot mediate the competition, instability rises. The mathematical structure of these 6 equations produces what dynamical systems theorists call a Hopf bifurcation. This is a technical term that I want to explain clearly because it is the key to the entire framework. In a Hopf bifurcation, a system transitions from a stable equilibrium, a fixed point where all the variables are balanced and the system stays put, to a limit cycle, a sustained oscillation where the variables go around and around in a repeating pattern. The transition happens when a parameter crosses a critical threshold, Below the threshold, the system finds balance. Above the threshold, the system oscillates. It does not choose to oscillate. It cannot help oscillating. The oscillation is a mathematical consequence of the structure of the equations. This is exactly the same kind of bifurcation that produces predator-prey oscillations in the Lotka-Volterra system. And in 2024, a paper by Whitman and Queen published in PLOS ONE confirmed formally that Turchin's DFM produces Hopf bifurcation oscillations and identified what they called a paradox of enrichment analog, the same phenomenon that occurs in ecology when enriching a prey population, making more resources available, paradoxically destabilizes the system by enabling predator overshoot. In human terms, economic growth that primarily enriches the elite class does not stabilize the system. It destabilizes it. By feeding the wealth pump, it accelerates elite proliferation, which accelerates elite overproduction, which accelerates intra-elite competition, which increases instability. The system gets richer and more unstable at the same time. The growth itself is the problem. I want you to hold on to that insight because it runs counter to everything the standard economic narrative tells you. The standard story says growth is good, recession is bad, and if we just grow the economy, everything works out. Turchin's model says that it matters enormously who captures the growth. Growth that flows to the productive base stabilizes the system by increasing the relative wage and reducing the mass mobilization potential. Growth that flows to the elite class destabilizes the system by inflating elite numbers without expanding elite positions. The same GDP number can be stabilizing or destabilizing depending on how it is distributed. And since the 1970s, the distribution in the United States has been relentlessly, mathematically, measurably tilting toward the elite class. And here is where it gets uncomfortable, because the mapping Turchin created between the biological model and the social model is not vague. It is precise. And what it says about the relationship between elites and ordinary people is something that makes almost everyone on every part of the political spectrum deeply uneasy. In the biological model, predators consume prey. As the prey base grows, predators proliferate. As predators proliferate, they deplete the prey base. The prey population crashes. Then, because the food supply has collapsed, the predator population crashes too. Overshoot, collapse, recovery, oscillation. In Turchin's social model, the mapping is this. Commoners, the productive base of the population, the people who grow food and build things and do the actual work, are the prey. Elites, the people who extract wealth from the productive base through rent-seeking, credential gatekeeping, regulatory capture, and institutional control, are the predators. That is not a metaphor. That is the mathematical structure and the mechanism by which the predators extract from the prey. Turchin gave that a name in his 2023 book End Times. He called it the wealth pump, the institutional machinery, the combination of policy, deregulation, technological displacement, immigration-driven labor oversupply, weakened unions, and financialization that systematically transfers wealth from the productive base to the elite class. When the wealth pump is running, elites grow richer and more numerous. Commoners stagnate or decline, and the system oscillates toward crisis exactly the way a predator-prey system oscillates toward a population crash. But the predator-prey analogy only gets you part of the way, because in an ecological system, the predators are all the same species. Wolves are wolves. They compete with each other, sure, but they are all fundamentally doing the same thing. In a human society, the elite class is not homogeneous, and this is where Turchin's model becomes genuinely dangerous. Because what happens when you overproduce elites? When you have more people with elite credentials and elite ambitions than there are elite positions to absorb them, is not just inequality, it is something much worse. You get counter-elites. I need to spend time on this concept because it is the piece of Turchin's model that I think has the most explanatory power for the current moment. And it is the piece that is least understood. In ecological terms, when a predator population overshoots the carrying capacity of its prey base, the predators do not all die equally. The weakest die first. The ones at the margins, the ones who were already struggling to find food, are the first to go. But the ones who are strong enough to survive the crash do not simply accept reduced circumstances. They turn on each other. Intraspecific competition intensifies as the resource base shrinks. The predators start competing not just with other species, but with their own kind, for territory, for the remaining prey, for survival. In human terms, this translates to something specific and measurable. When a society produces more people with elite aspirations than there are elite positions to absorb, the surplus does not quietly disappear. It curdles. The frustrated law school graduates who cannot find partner track positions, the PhD holders teaching adjunct courses for $28,000 a year with no benefits, no job security, and $150,000 in debt. The would-be tech entrepreneurs locked out of markets dominated by 5 companies that collectively control the digital economy. The mid-career professionals who were told that a graduate degree was the ticket to financial security and discovered that the ticket had been oversold by a factor of 3. These people do not just accept their fate. They have the education, the networks, the analytical skills, and the rhetorical ability to do something far more destabilizing than protest. They organize. They articulate grievances. They develop ideological frameworks. They become movement leaders. Turchin calls them counter-elites, and the term is precise. They are not anti-elite. They are counter-elite. They are not against the concept of elite status. They want it. They believe they deserve it. They did everything the system told them to do, and the system reneged on the implicit promise. And their anger is not the diffuse, unfocused anger of the economically desperate. It is the sharp, targeted anger of the educated and betrayed. Look at the leadership cadre of virtually every major political movement of the last decade, left or right, and you will find counter-elites. People with Ivy League degrees and 6-figure student debt, working at think tanks for $40,000 a year, writing policy papers that nobody reads, watching their classmates who got the Goldman Sachs internship buy apartments in Manhattan while they share a basement studio in Washington. People who went to Yale Law and ended up doing contract work, reviewing documents in a warehouse in New Jersey, while their student loan servicer calls every month. These are not the downtrodden masses of Marxist theory. These are the frustrated aspirant elites of Turchin's model. And they are the most politically dangerous demographic in any society, because they have the skills to channel mass discontent into organized action and the personal motivation to do so. Turchin was explicit about this in End Times, published in 2023 by Penguin. He identified Trump as a canonical counter-elite figure, not a populist in the traditional sense, a billionaire who had the wealth trappings of the elite class, but was never accepted by the political establishment, who was mocked at the White House Correspondents' Dinner, who was treated as a joke by the donor class and the media class that together constitute the established American elite, and who responded by building a political movement that explicitly targeted those institutions. The model does not predict Trump by name. It predicts the structural conditions that produce someone like Trump, a figure from within the elite class who is excluded or marginalized by the inner circle and turns that exclusion into a political weapon. And the model says the same dynamic operates on the left. The progressive movement's leadership is disproportionately drawn from the same demographic pool, highly educated, heavily credentialed young people who expected the meritocratic bargain to deliver them a secure, meaningful career, and discovered that the bargain was broken. The ideological framing is different. The structural origin is the same. Elite, overproduction, too many people trained for too few positions. The surplus turns to politics, because politics is one of the few arenas where credentials and rhetorical skill can be converted into status without requiring a slot in the existing economic hierarchy. This is not a partisan observation. This is a structural one. And the fact that it cuts across political lines is precisely what makes it so dangerous, because it means the counter-elite dynamic cannot be resolved by either side winning. Both sides are products of the same structural pressure. Both sides will continue to be produced by it as long as the pressure persists. And the pressure persists as long as the wealth pump runs and the credential pipeline keeps inflating the number of elite aspirants beyond what the economy can absorb. The frustrated law school graduates who cannot find partner-track positions, the PhD holders teaching adjunct courses for poverty wages, the entrepreneurs locked out of markets dominated by incumbents, the ambitious, educated, credentialed people who did everything the system told them to do and discovered that the system had no room for them. These people do not just accept their fate and quietly join the middle class. They have the education, the networks, and the rhetorical skills to do something far more destabilizing. They mobilize. They become the leaders of populist movements. They channel the immiseration of ordinary people into organized political action directed against the established elite. And this is the part of the model that maps onto the last decade with a precision that should make you uncomfortable, regardless of your political orientation. Because it does not matter whether the counter-elite comes from the left or the right. The model does not predict ideology. It predicts structure. It predicts that when elite overproduction reaches a critical threshold, when the gap between credentials and positions becomes wide enough, someone from the frustrated elite class will channel mass discontent into an assault on the existing power structure. The model predicts the structural conditions for a figure like Donald Trump, without ever mentioning his name. A billionaire who could not get accepted by the political establishment, who turned the resentment of the credentialed but excluded class and the working class base into a political movement that explicitly targets the institutions his model said would be targeted. That should disturb you, not because of Trump specifically, but because the model says the same thing about the other side and about the next figure after Trump, and the one after that, because the structural pressures that produce the current crisis are still building. But I am getting ahead of myself. We need to go through the math first, because the math is where the prediction actually lives. And the math is what makes this more than a clever narrative. Turchin formalized his model into what he calls structural demographic theory, or SDT. It has three main components, each measured by specific, quantifiable variables. And the critical feature of the model is that these three components do not add together, they multiply. The first component is popular immiseration. Turchin measures this using a variable he calls the mass mobilization potential, or MMP. It is driven by three subvariables: the relative wage, which is the median wage divided by GDP per capita, the urbanization rate, and the size of the youth cohort, specifically the share of the population aged 20 to 29. When the relative wage is depressed, when people are crowded into cities, and when there is a large population of young adults, the mass mobilization potential is high. People are poor, concentrated, and young. That is the structural precondition for unrest. The second component is elite overproduction. Turchin measures this using the elite mobilization potential, or EMP. It is driven by the number of elite aspirants divided by the number of elite positions available. When you have far more people who believe they deserve an elite lifestyle than there are slots for them to occupy, the EMP spikes, and the frustration of those surplus elites turns into political energy. The third component is state fiscal distress, measured as the public debt to GDP ratio divided by a measure of trust in government. When the state is deep in debt and nobody trusts the people running it, the fiscal distress variable is high. And the political stress indicator, the PSI, which is Turchin's headline metric for predicting instability, is the product of these three components, not the sum, the product. PSI equals MMP times EMP times SFD. This matters enormously because multiplication means the system is non-linear. If all three components are moderate, the PSI is moderate. But if all three are elevated simultaneously, which is what Turchin observed happening in America starting in the 1970s, the PSI does not just increase, it explodes. The multiplicative relationship produces what Turchin calls the hockey stick, a long, flat period of stability followed by a sudden, sharp, near-vertical rise. And the shape of that curve, when Turchin plotted it using American data going back to 1780, matched the shape he had already documented in the population dynamics of pine beetles and lemmings. The oscillation, the boom and the crash, endogenous, not exogenous, generated by the internal dynamics of the system itself. I want to stop here for a moment and make sure the weight of this lands properly. Because what Turchin is claiming is not that politics feels cyclical, or that history rhymes, or any of the other comfortable clichés people use to gesture at the idea that things come and go. He is claiming that the rise and fall of political stability in complex societies follows mathematically describable dynamics, that those dynamics are generated by the same class of non-linear coupled equations that describe predator-prey systems in ecology, and that those equations, applied to American data, produced a specific prediction, instability peaking around 2020. He published that prediction in 2010, in Nature, with his name on it. And now let me show you what happens when you test the prediction against what actually happened. In Ages of Discord, published in 2016, by his own imprint, Baresta Books, Turchin laid out the American data in excruciating detail. Every indicator he tracked showed the same pattern. The turning point was the 1970s. Real wages, which had been rising steadily through the post-war period, tracking productivity gains roughly 1-to-1, decoupled from productivity around 1973. From that point forward, productivity continued to climb, while real wages for production workers flattened and eventually began to decline in real terms. The wealth pump switched on. The gains from economic growth that had previously been shared across the population began flowing disproportionately to the top. The number of American households worth $10 million or more, adjusting for inflation, increased roughly tenfold between 1983 and 2019, reaching approximately 693,000. The top 1%'s share of national income, which had bottomed out around 8% in the late 1970s, climbed steadily back toward levels not seen since the Gilded Age, passing 20% by 2015. Meanwhile, elite overproduction accelerated. Law school enrollment expanded far beyond what the legal job market could absorb. By the 2010s, the distribution of starting salaries for new law graduates had become bimodal, a pattern that economists found disturbing. There were Two peaks, one around $60,000, another around $190,000. The middle had vanished. You were either on the partner track at a major firm, or you were struggling. The same pattern repeated in MBAs, PhD programs, medical residencies. The credential pipeline kept expanding. The number of positions at the top did not, and state fiscal distress mounted year over year. Public debt, as a share of GDP, climbed from roughly 30% in the early 1980s past 100% by 2020. Trust in the federal government, as measured by Pew Research and Gallup, fell from over 70% in the late 1950s to below 20% by 2020. Turchin plotted his PSI index, the multiplicative product of all three components, on a graph spanning American history from 1780 to the present. The result was a curve that looked like a heartbeat. Two previous peaks, one in the 1860s, the run-up to the Civil War, one in the 1920s, the era of labor violence, anarchist bombings, and the Red Scare, and then a long trough through the post-war period, the era of relative stability, shared prosperity, and bipartisan consensus, followed by a turn in the 1970s, followed by a climb that goes nearly vertical. The PSI curve crests around 2020. He published this in 2016, 4 years before the pandemic, 5 years before January 6th. I want to slow down here and walk through the data carefully, because the specificity is what separates Turchin's work from the kind of vague, the system is broken commentary you can find in any opinion column. The specificity is what makes the prediction real. Start with the relative wage. Turchin defines this as the median wage divided by GDP per capita. It measures how much of the total economic output flows to the typical worker. During the integrative phase, roughly 1945 through 1973, the relative wage was high and stable. Real hourly compensation for production and non-supervisory workers, which the Bureau of Labor Statistics tracks, grew at roughly 2% per year, matching productivity growth almost exactly. If the economy grew by $1, about $1 more ended up in the average worker's pocket. This was not an accident. It was the result of a specific institutional configuration, strong unions, high marginal tax rates, above 90% on the highest incomes under Eisenhower, regulated financial markets, a minimum wage that was regularly adjusted upward. The wealth pump was reversed, or at least idle. In 1973, the relationship broke. Productivity continued to rise. Real hourly compensation for production workers flatlined. Between 1973 and 2019, productivity in the non-farm business sector grew by roughly 70%. Real hourly compensation for production workers grew by roughly 12%. The gap between those two numbers, roughly 58 percentage points of productivity growth that did not flow to ordinary workers, is the wealth pump in numerical form. That surplus went somewhere. It went to corporate profits, to executive compensation, to returns on capital. The top 1%'s share of national income roughly doubled between 1980 and 2020, from about 10% to about 20%. Now, layer on elite overproduction. In 1970, approximately 37,000 Americans received doctoral degrees. By 2020, that number had risen to roughly 84,000 per year. The number of law degrees awarded annually roughly doubled between the 1960s and the 2010s. MBA programs expanded even faster. The credential pipeline was churning out elite aspirants at a rate that the economy could not possibly absorb into elite positions. Turchin documented the resulting compression using the bimodal salary distribution for new law graduates, which is publicly available from the National Association for Law Placement. The two peaks, one around 60,000 and one around 190,000, represent two entirely different career trajectories. You are either on the fast track or you are struggling. The middle-class lawyer, the small-town practitioner who makes a comfortable but not extravagant living, was being squeezed out of existence. And the ones who ended up at the bottom peak, the $60,000 peak, were the surplus elites, the frustrated counter-elite aspirants, the people who did everything right, got the degree, passed the bar, accumulated $150,000 in student debt, and discovered that the system had no place for them. The third variable, state fiscal distress. In 1980, federal public debt as a share of GDP was approximately 26%. By 2000, it had risen to about 55%. By 2010, it was roughly 90%. By 2020, it had crossed 100%. And trust in the federal government, which Pew Research has been tracking since 1958, fell from 77% in 1964 to around 20% in 2020, and has not recovered. Divide the debt ratio by the trust index, and you get the state fiscal distress variable, which essentially measures how indebted the government is relative to how much the population trusts it to manage that debt. Both numbers moved in the wrong direction simultaneously for 40 years. Now multiply MMP times EMP times SFD, the nonlinear product, the hockey stick. Turchin plotted the PSI from 1780 to the present. The curve shows two previous peaks, one in the 1860s, reaching its maximum in the years immediately before the Civil War, one in the 1920s, the era of labor violence, the Palmer raids, the KKK's nationwide resurgence, anarchist bombings, and the Red Scare. Then, a descent through the 30s, 40s, and 50s as the New Deal reforms took effect and the integrative cycle re-engaged. A trough in the 1960s, and then the turn, the slow climb beginning in the 70s, accelerating through the 80s and 90s, going nearly vertical in the 2010s, cresting around 2020. The shape of the 1970s to 2020s climb mirrors the shape of the 1820s to 1860s climb with a precision that is frankly eerie. Same slope, same inflection points, same relative magnitude, two different centuries, two different economies, two different political systems, the same mathematical curve. And then reality ran the experiment for him. 2020. A global pandemic hits a country whose public health infrastructure had been hollowed out by decades of defunding. The federal response fractures along political lines. Trust in institutions, already at historic lows, collapses further. 40 million Americans file unemployment claims in the space of 10 weeks. The Federal Reserve pumps trillions into financial markets, producing one of the largest stock market rallies in history, while ordinary Americans wait in food bank lines that stretch for miles. I want you to understand what that looked like through the lens of the model. Because from inside the experience, 2020 felt like a crisis caused by a virus, an external shock, an act of nature, and the virus was real. The shock was real, but the model says the virus was a trigger, not a cause. The cause was structural, and the way a society responds to an external shock is itself determined by the structural conditions that precede it. A society in the integrative phase absorbs shocks. It has institutional resilience, social cohesion, elite consensus, and fiscal reserves. The 1918 influenza pandemic killed an estimated 675,000 Americans. It did not produce political collapse. It did not fragment the federal response along partisan lines. It did not generate a conspiracy theory ecosystem that questioned the existence of the virus itself. Because the structural conditions in 1918, while not perfect, were fundamentally different from the structural conditions in 2020. Trust in government was higher. Elite cohesion was stronger. The wealth pump had not yet been running for 4 decades. The system had reserves. A society in the disintegrative phase does not absorb shocks, it amplifies them. Every stress becomes a fracture line. Every policy disagreement becomes an existential conflict. Every institution that is supposed to coordinate the response becomes a battleground. And that is precisely what happened in 2020. The pandemic did not create the fractures. The fractures were already there, measured and documented in Turchin's PSI curve, which was at its highest point since the 1860s. The pandemic simply applied pressure to a system that was already at capacity. The dam did not break because of the rainstorm. The dam broke because it had been cracking for years, and the rainstorm was the last thing it could handle. Then, in the summer of 2020, after the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, the largest protest movement in American history erupted across hundreds of cities. Whatever your politics, whatever you think about the causes and the conduct of those protests, from a structural demographic perspective, they were predictable. A large, young, urbanized population with stagnant real wages and declining economic prospects, the exact demographic that the mass mobilization potential variable is designed to measure. Confronted with a triggering event that crystallized decades of accumulated grievance, the model does not predict George Floyd. It predicts the structural conditions that turn a single event into a national conflagration. 2021, January 6th. A sitting president's supporters stormed the United States Capitol in an attempt to prevent the certification of an election. Turchin blogged about it the next day. He wrote, and I spent time reading this post because the tone of it matters, that on one level, that of macro-social dynamics, what happened on January 6th was not surprising. He said the structural pressures for instability continue to build up. He compared the scenes in Washington to revolutionary crowds he had studied in Ukraine, Armenia, and Tajikistan. There is a remarkable quality to Turchin's writing on January 6th. He is not shocked. He is not outraged. He is measured, almost clinical, the way a seismologist would describe an earthquake they had been predicting for a decade. The ground shook. The buildings fell. The instruments registered the magnitude. This was expected. The specific fault that ruptured was not predicted, but the fact that a rupture would occur was baked into the pressure readings years ago. He wrote that he was not terribly surprised because this is what he had been saying for 10 years, but that it always comes as a surprise, seeing one of the country's central institutions stormed. That sentence captures something I think is genuinely important about the relationship between mathematical prediction and lived experience. You can know the math. You can see the curves. You can publish the forecast. And when the forecast comes true, it still shocks you. Because knowledge and experience are different things. The equations describe the system from above. You experience the system from inside. And from inside, every crisis feels unprecedented, even when it was mathematically inevitable. He was not surprised. He had been saying this for 10 years. But he also said the structural pressures were still building. And here is the part that gets worse. Because Turchin did not treat 2020 as the peak. He treated it as a confirmation that the underlying dynamics were operating as predicted. But the model did not say the pressure would peak and then subside. The model said the pressure would continue to build. In a 2022 interview with Yukon Today, 1 year after January 6th, Turchin warned explicitly that 2024 is the one where our system will really be put under huge strain. In 2025, speaking to Newsweek, he said nearly every one of those indicators has intensified. He pointed to AI-driven displacement of the professional class, the very population most vulnerable to elite overproduction dynamics, as the latest accelerant. He used a phrase that I cannot stop thinking about. He said, "We are in a revolutionary situation." That is not a pundit's opinion. That is a mathematical model's output, described by the man who built the model, assessed against the data in real time. I want to address something here that I know a significant portion of the audience is thinking, because it comes up in virtually every discussion of Turchin's work. The Asimov comparison. Isaac Asimov's Foundation series, published starting in 1951, features a mathematician named Hari Seldon who develops a discipline called psychohistory, which can predict the future behavior of large populations using mathematical equations. The comparison seems obvious. Turchin is Hari Seldon. Cliodynamics is psychohistory. History can be predicted. Turchin himself has publicly and repeatedly rejected this comparison, and his reasons for rejecting it are worth understanding because they illuminate what the model actually does and does not claim. Hari Seldon's psychohistory was deterministic. It could predict specific events, specific outcomes, specific timelines, centuries into the future. It worked because Asimov's fictional universe assumed that the behavior of sufficiently large populations is as deterministic as the behavior of gas molecules in a closed container. Given enough data and the right equations, the future is calculable. Turchin's model is not deterministic. It is probabilistic. It does not predict events. It predicts pressures. It does not tell you what will happen. It tells you what kind of things are more likely to happen given the current structural configuration. The earthquake analogy is the one Turchin uses most frequently, and it is precisely chosen. Seismologists can tell you that a particular fault zone is under pressure. They can estimate the probability of a major earthquake within a given time window. They can even estimate the likely magnitude range. What they cannot tell you is the date, the time, or the precise epicenter, the trigger that actually initiates the rupture, the specific microfracture in the specific rock at the specific depth, is stochastic, unpredictable. But the pressure that made the rupture inevitable is measurable, and it was there before the rupture occurred. The distinction matters enormously because a deterministic model would be either terrifying if you believed it, or dismissible as hubris if you did not. A probabilistic model is something else entirely. It is a tool. It tells you where the pressure is. It tells you how much pressure has accumulated. It tells you what has historically happened when similar levels of pressure were present. And it tells you what interventions have historically been effective at reducing the pressure before the rupture. Turchin is not Hari Seldon. He is a seismologist of civilizations, and what his instruments are showing is that the pressure readings are in the critical range, the range associated historically with major societal ruptures. That does not mean a rupture is certain. It means the conditions for one are present. And it means that ignoring the readings because the future is unpredictable is the intellectual equivalent of ignoring earthquake warnings because you cannot specify the exact date the ground will shake. And still, almost nobody is talking about it. Not in Congress, not in the mainstream press, except for the occasional feature article that treats Turchin as a curiosity rather than a source of actionable intelligence. Not in the institutions that are supposed to anticipate and prevent exactly this kind of systemic crisis. I want you to hold on to that feeling. The feeling of how is this not front page news? Because it is going to get stronger as we go deeper. Because we have not even gotten to the database yet. The one with 168 crises. The the one spanning 10,000 years, the one that answers the question you should be asking right now, which is, what happens next? But before I can show you what the database found, you need to understand the deeper mathematical structure, the secular cycles, because the American crisis is not just a blip on a chart. According to Turchin's model, it is the latest iteration of a pattern that has been repeating for as long as civilizations have existed. A pattern with a rhythm, a frequency, a wavelength. And the wavelength is about 200 to 300 years. In 2009, Turchin and his collaborator Sergei Nefedov, a historian at the Institute of History and Archaeology in Yekaterinburg, Russia, published a book called Secular Cycles through Princeton University Press. In it, they analyzed 8 historical case studies in detail: medieval and early modern England, France, the Roman Republic, and the Principate, medieval and early modern Russia. And in each case, they documented the same 4-phase cycle. Phase 1 is the integrative phase. Population is growing, wages are rising, elites are cohesive. The state has resources and legitimacy. This is the good time, the era of expansion and consensus. In American terms, this is roughly the 1940s through the 1970s. Phase 2 is the stagflation phase. Population growth begins to outstrip the available resources. Wages stagnate. The first signs of elite overproduction appear. The state begins running deficits. This is the transition period, the hinge. In American terms, this is the late 1970s through the 1990s. Phase 3 is the crisis phase. Wages are depressed. Elite overproduction is acute. The state is fiscally stressed and losing legitimacy. Social unrest accelerates. Counter-elites emerge and begin challenging the established power structure. In American terms, this is now, phase 4 is the depression or resolution phase. The crisis either resolves through negotiated reform, with elites accepting constraints on their power and wealth, or it escalates into civil war, revolution, or state collapse. The full cycle runs roughly 200 to 300 years in Western European agrarian societies. And nested within the long cycle, Turchin identified a shorter oscillation that he calls the fathers and sons cycle. It runs roughly 50 years, 2 human generations. In American history, the peaks of this shorter cycle fall at approximately 1870, 1920, 1970, and 2020. 4 peaks, 4 generations, each one marked by surges of political violence and social upheaval. I need to be careful here and honest with you. 4 data points is not a statistically robust sample for establishing a 50-year oscillation. Turchin himself acknowledges this. Jack Goldstone, his most important collaborator, has not endorsed the fathers and sons cycle as a standalone finding. The evidence for the longer secular cycle, the 200 to 300 year pattern, is much stronger, supported by the 8 case studies in secular cycles and by the broader database Turchin built later. The 50-year rhythm is suggestive, not proven. I tell you this because the audience for this kind of work deserves honesty about where the evidence is strong and where it is still developing. Turchin is not infallible. The model is not settled science. But the core prediction, the one published in Nature in 2010, was confirmed, and the critics who dismissed it have not offered a better explanation for why every variable he identified moved exactly where he said it would. I need to pause here because I think the sheer accumulation of mathematics and historical pattern matching can numb you to the emotional reality of what this framework is saying about your own life. The secular cycles, the Lotka-Volterra equations, the Hopf bifurcations, the PSI calculation, these are abstractions They are powerful abstractions, precisely defined and empirically tested. But they are abstractions, and the danger of abstractions is that they create distance between you and the thing being described. So let me close that distance. If you are between the ages of 25 and 45, you have lived your entire adult life inside the rising phase of the PSI curve. Every political shock you have experienced, every institutional failure, every economic disruption, every cultural conflict that felt unprecedented and inexplicable was occurring within a structural context that Turchin's model describes with mathematical precision. The 2008 financial crisis, the Occupy movement, the Tea Party, the rise of Trump, the pandemic response, the George Floyd protests, January 6th, the contentious elections, the erosion of trust in media, in medicine, in government, in each other. None of these were random. None of these were unprecedented. They were surface expressions of structural dynamics that have been building since before you were born. You did not cause these dynamics. You cannot individually reverse them, but you are living inside them, and the model says they have not peaked. That is the personal implication, not an abstraction. Your life, your career, your children's future, sitting on a curve that the man who drew it says is still climbing. And there is something else the model reveals when you look at the specific period we are in. In the historical cases Turchin studied, the PSI does not peak and then gently decline. It reaches a critical range, a zone where the structural conditions are present for major rupture, and then the system enters what he calls the crisis phase. The crisis phase is not a moment, it is a period. It can last decades. The Roman crisis phase ran from the Gracchi in 133 BCE to the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE, 100 years. The French crisis phase ran from the convening of the Estates General in 1789 through the fall of the Second Empire in 1870, 80 years. Even the American Civil War era, which feels like a single event, was actually the culmination of a crisis phase that began in the 1830s with the nullification crisis and did not fully resolve until the Compromise of 1877. If the American system entered its current crisis phase around 2020, as the PSI curve suggests, then we are at the beginning of the crisis, not the end of it. The model does not predict when the crisis resolves. It predicts that the structural conditions for crisis persist until either the variables reverse through deliberate reform or the system ruptures and resets through violence or collapse. There is no third option in the historical record. No case in the database where the variables remained in the critical range and the crisis simply faded on its own. Crises end through action or through rupture. They do not end through inaction. Now, there is a level of the story we have not reached yet, and it is the level that Turchin himself considers the most important. More important than the prediction, more important than the PSI curve, more important than the secular cycles, the database, Crisis DB. In 2011, Turchin co-founded a project called SESHAT, the Global History Databank, together with Harvey Whitehouse, an anthropologist at the University of Oxford, and Peter Francois, also at Oxford. The name comes from the ancient Egyptian goddess of writing and record keeping. The ambition was extraordinary. They set out to create a systematic, quantitative database of human societies across the entire span of recorded history. Approximately 600 theoretically motivated variables, coded across 30 natural geographic areas, 414 polities, spanning roughly 10,000 years. By 2019, the database contained nearly 300,000 individual records. And within SESHAT, Turchin and his colleague Daniel Hoyer built a sub-database focused specifically on societal crises. They called it CrisisDB. It catalogued 168 crises from the Bronze Age to the early 20th century. Each crisis was coded against the structural, demographic variables. Each outcome was classified, and the results were published. But before I get to what CrisisDB found, I need to take you through the historical evidence that convinced Turchin the model was real. Because the American case is compelling, but it is one data point. The power of the framework comes from its application across centuries, across continents, across political systems that had nothing in common except the structural dynamics underneath them. In secular cycles, Turchin and Nefedov analyzed 8 case studies in rigorous detail. Let me walk you through 2 of them, because they are the ones that map most directly onto the American present, and because the pattern, once you see it, becomes impossible to unsee. The first is the Roman Republic in its final century. The Roman case is the one Turchin returns to most frequently, and the one he considers the closest structural analog to contemporary America, and the parallels are specific enough to be unnerving. The Roman Republic experienced its integrative phase roughly from the late 4th century BCE through the mid-2nd century BCE. This was the era of expansion. The conquest of Italy, the Punic Wars, the subjugation of Greece and the Eastern Mediterranean. Land was plentiful because the Republic kept conquering new territory. Citizen soldiers fought the wars and received land grants in return. The wealth generated by conquest was distributed broadly enough to maintain social cohesion. The elite class, the patricians and the senatorial order, were wealthy, but their wealth was constrained by social norms, legal restrictions on land accumulation, and the political power of the popular assemblies. Then the structural dynamics shifted. By the mid-2nd century BCE, the conquests had slowed. Available land dried up, but the elite class kept growing. Wealthy Romans began accumulating vast estates, the latifundia, worked by slave labor captured in the wars of expansion. Small citizen farmers, unable to compete with slave-worked plantations, lost their land and migrated to Rome, swelling the urban population. The relative wage collapsed. A massive pool of dispossessed, urbanized, angry young men accumulated in the city. This is popular immiseration, the first variable in Turchin's model. Meanwhile, the senatorial class expanded. More families competed for a fixed number of magistracies. The cursus honorum, the sequential ladder of public offices that defined a Roman political career, became impossibly crowded. Men who a generation earlier would have been guaranteed a praetorship or a consulship found themselves shut out. The number of aspirants exceeded the number of positions. This is elite overproduction, the second variable, and the state's fiscal situation deteriorated. The costs of maintaining an enormous military, administering far-flung provinces, and placating an increasingly restive urban population outstripped revenues. Public debt accumulated. Provincial governance became increasingly extractive as the state tried to cover its costs. This is state fiscal distress, the third variable. The PSI equivalent in Rome peaked in the late 2nd century BCE. And what happened next is exactly what the model predicts. A counter-elite emerged. Tiberius Gracchus, a patrician from one of Rome's most distinguished families, proposed radical land reform in 133 BCE, redistributing public land to dispossessed citizens. The senatorial establishment, the established elite, murdered him on the steps of the Capitol. His brother Gaius continued the reform program and was also killed. The pattern had begun. Frustrated elites mobilizing the immiserated populace against the established order. The established order responding with violence. The violence escalating. What followed was a century of civil wars. Marius and Sulla, Caesar and Pompey, Octavian and Antony. Each conflict was triggered by specific individuals and specific grievances, but the structural dynamic underneath was always the same. Too many elites competing for too few positions. Too many dispossessed commoners available for mobilization. A state too fiscally stressed and too politically paralyzed to implement reform. The Republic did not fall because of any single person or any single event. It fell because the structural conditions made some kind of fall mathematically inevitable. The triggers were interchangeable. The pressure was not. Now think about that for a moment and ask yourself whether the pattern sounds familiar. The second case I want to walk through is pre-revolutionary France. The Bourbon monarchy in the 18th century is the case Turchin uses to illustrate how the crisis phase can persist for decades before the actual rupture, and how the rupture, when it comes, often surprises everyone who was not looking at the structural indicators. France's integrative phase ran roughly from the mid-17th century after the end of the Wars of Religion and the Fronde, through the early 18th century. Population grew, agricultural productivity improved. The state was solvent and powerful under Louis XIV. The elite class was constrained by absolutist monarchy, which centralized power and limited the capacity of individual nobles to act independently. Then the dynamics shifted. Population growth outpaced agricultural productivity. Real wages for peasants and laborers began declining in the 1740s. By the 1780s, the average French laborer was spending roughly 88% of his income on bread alone. Bread, a single food item consuming 7/8 of total income. That is immiseration at a scale that is almost impossible for a modern American to comprehend. But it is precisely measured. We have the price data. We have the wage records. Turchin and Nefedov cite Labrousse's 1944 classic economic study of the Ancien Régime. Meanwhile, the nobility expanded. The French crown sold noble titles to raise revenue, inflating the elite class. By the late 18th century, there were approximately 400,000 nobles in France, roughly 1.5% of the population, competing for a limited number of court positions, military commands, and ecclesiastical benefices. The surplus elites, the younger sons of minor noble families, the recently ennobled bourgeois who found themselves shut out of the inner circles, became the backbone of the Enlightenment critique of the Ancien Régime. Voltaire, Rousseau, the encyclopedists, these were not peasants demanding bread. They were educated, ambitious men who believed they deserved positions of influence and were denied them by a system that reserved the top slots for a handful of established families. Counter-elites, the model's term for them, educated, frustrated, equipped with the rhetorical and organizational skills to channel mass discontent into political action. And the state's fiscal situation was catastrophic. Decades of warfare, from the 7 Years' War through the American Revolution, had left the French treasury empty. The deficit by 1788 was approximately 20% of total revenues. The monarchy's attempts to impose new taxes on the nobility were blocked by the Parlement, the judicial bodies dominated by the noblesse de robe, who refused to ratify fiscal reform. The state could not tax the people who had the money, because the people who had the money controlled the institutions that authorized taxation. Does that sound familiar? The revolution, when it came in 1789, was triggered by a specific event the convening of the Estates General to address the fiscal crisis. But the structural conditions had been building for decades. The immiseration was measured, the elite overproduction was documented, the fiscal distress was quantified, the eruption was structurally inevitable. The specific trigger was not. I spend time on these cases because they make the American data harder to dismiss. If Turchin's model only described America, you could call it a clever narrative. But it describes Rome, it describes France, it describes Plantagenet and Tudor England, it describes Muscovite and Roman of Russia, it describes Han and Tang China, it describes the same pattern, driven by the same variables, producing the same outcomes across societies that had no contact with each other, no shared culture, no common political system. The only thing they shared was the structural dynamics, population pressure, elite overproduction, state fiscal distress, crisis. And the math that describes those dynamics is the same math that describes population crashes in beetles. Now let me tell you what CrisisDB found, because this is the part I have been building toward, and the part that I personally find the hardest to sit with. Here is what CrisisDB found, as published by Hoyer and colleagues at the Complexity Science Hub in Vienna, where Turchin has been based since 2020. Approximately 75% of the crises in the database ended in revolution, civil war, or outright state collapse. 40% of rulers were assassinated. 3/4 of crises ended in revolutions or civil wars, or both. 1 in 5 of those civil wars lasted a century or more, and 60% of the polities studied ceased to exist. Not reformed, not restructured, ceased to exist through internal disintegration or foreign conquest enabled by the internal weakness. 75%. I want you to sit with that number, because that is not a pundit's prediction. That is not a talking head on cable news speculating about worst-case scenarios. That is a base rate, derived from 168 data points spanning 10,000 years, calculated by the same research group that produced the most accurate forecast of American instability in the modern era. 75% of analogous situations ended badly, 3 out of 4, and the remaining 25%, the ones that avoided catastrophe, shared a specific, identifiable feature. In every case where a society successfully navigated a structural demographic crisis without descending into civil war or revolution, the ruling elite accepted constraints on their own power and wealth. They submitted to higher taxation. They broke up monopolies. They redistributed land. They expanded political participation. They reversed the wealth pump. Turchin highlights 4 specific historical examples. Early Republican Rome, where the conflict between patricians and plebeians was resolved through the creation of the tribune of the plebs and the Licinian Sextian laws, giving commoners a share of political power. Britain in the 1830s, where the Reform Act of 1832 expanded the franchise and diffused the pressure that had been building since the Napoleonic Wars, with the Chartist movement providing the additional push that led to further reforms. Russia in the 1860s, where the emancipation of the serfs and Alexander II's judicial and military reforms diffused pressure that might otherwise have produced revolution 50 years earlier than it actually came. And America's own progressive era and New Deal, where the graduated income tax, trust busting, labor protections, Social Security, and the Wagner Act reversed the wealth pump that had been running since the Gilded Age. I want to linger on the American case for a moment, because it is the one that speaks most directly to the present, and because the specific mechanisms of reform are documented in enough detail that we can compare them precisely to what is or is not happening now. The last time America's PSI curve was in the critical range before the current period was the Gilded Age through the Progressive Era. The 1890s looked, structurally, remarkably similar to the 2020s. Inequality was at extreme levels. The top 1% controlled an enormous share of national wealth. Corporate monopolies, the railroads, Standard Oil, US Steel, dominated entire sectors of the economy. Labor conditions were brutal. Wages for industrial workers were low and declining in real terms, and elite overproduction was manifest in the form of a vast, restless class of educated young men, products of the newly expanded university system, who found themselves locked out of meaningful positions by an economic structure designed to funnel wealth to a handful of industrial barons. The political response was the progressive movement. And what is remarkable about the progressive response, from the perspective of Turchin's model, is that it addressed all three structural variables simultaneously. The graduated income tax, introduced via the 16th Amendment in 1913, directly attacked the wealth pump by taxing concentrated wealth at high marginal rates. Trust busting, most visibly Theodore Roosevelt's prosecution of Northern securities and later the breakup of Standard Oil, reduced elite concentration by fragmenting monopolistic economic power. Labor protections from the 8-hour workday movement through the eventual passage of the Wagner Act in 1935 raised the relative wage by strengthening the bargaining position of ordinary workers, and the expansion of the civil service, the professionalization of government, and the creation of new federal agencies created new elite positions, absorbing some of the surplus elite aspirants into productive roles. The result was a dramatic reversal of the PSI curve. From the 1930s through the 1960s, inequality declined. Real wages rose. Elite competition moderated because the expanding post-war economy created enough positions to absorb the credentialed class. State fiscal health improved as growth broadened the tax base. Trust in government climbed to its all-time high of 77% in 1964. The integrative cycle re-engaged, and then the wealth pump switched back on in the 1970s, and every single reform that had reversed the previous crisis was systematically unwound over the following 4 decades. Top marginal tax rates were cut from above 70% in 1980 to below 40%. Corporate regulation was rolled back. Union membership declined from roughly 35% of the private sector workforce in the 1950s to below 7% by 2020. The financial sector was deregulated, producing the conditions for the 2008 crisis. And the credential pipeline was dramatically expanded without a corresponding expansion of elite positions, creating the elite overproduction dynamic that drives the current crisis. This is not ancient history. This is the direct, documented, measurable undoing of the reforms that stabilized the American system for a generation. And the fact that it happened gradually, over decades, without any single decisive moment, without any villainous conspiracy, through the ordinary operation of political and economic incentives, is precisely what makes it so hard for people to see. There was no single decision to switch the wealth pump back on. There were thousands of decisions. Tax bills, deregulatory riders attached to appropriations legislation, judicial rulings that weakened labor protections, trade agreements that exposed domestic workers to global wage competition. Each one was justified on its own terms. Each one was debated on its own merits. And collectively, over 40 years, they reassembled exactly the structural conditions that the Progressive and New Deal reforms had dismantled. The model does not say this was a conspiracy. The model says This is what happens in the normal operation of the secular cycle. The integrative reforms work. The pressure drops, the system stabilizes. And then, because the pressure is gone, because the crisis has passed, because nobody remembers what it felt like to be on the edge, the reforms are gradually eroded by the people who bear their costs. The elites who were constrained by high taxation and strong regulation push to have those constraints relaxed. And because they are elites, because they have disproportionate political influence, they succeed. And the cycle begins again. What these four cases share is not ideology. They span monarchies, republics, and empires. What they share is a structural dynamic. The elites gave something up, not voluntarily, not cheerfully, but under pressure, they accepted constraints on their extraction. They agreed to be taxed, regulated, and held accountable. And the system stabilized. Now look at the present. Is any of that happening? The wealth pump is still running. It has been running since the 1970s, and it has not reversed. Real wages remain decoupled from productivity. The share of income going to the top has continued to climb. Elite overproduction is accelerating, not decelerating. AI is now threatening to displace exactly the professional class: lawyers, analysts, consultants, content creators, that was already oversaturated with credentialed aspirants who had no clear path to the positions they were trained for. Federal trust polling remains at historic lows. Public debt continues to grow. And the political system, rather than producing the kind of structural reform that the 25% of successful cases required, is producing exactly the kind of institutional breakdown and counter-elite mobilization that the 75% of unsuccessful cases exhibited. Turchin told Newsweek in May of 2025, reflecting on the second Trump administration and the DOGE-driven government layoffs at USAID and across the federal bureaucracy, that nearly every one of those indicators has intensified. He described the current situation as a revolutionary situation. He compared the trajectory to the late Roman Republic, to late Bourbon France before 1789, to antebellum America in the 1850s, and to late Qing China. The viewer can look at those four analogues and draw their own conclusions about what came next in each case. The Roman Republic produced a century of civil wars culminating in the destruction of the Republic itself. Bourbon France produced the Revolution and the Terror. Antebellum America produced the Civil War. Late Qing China produced the Xinhai Revolution and decades of warlordism and civil conflict. But here is the thing I keep coming back to, the thing that I personally find the most difficult to absorb. Turchin does not predict specific events. He has said this repeatedly, and he means it. The model is probabilistic, not deterministic. He uses the earthquake analogy. You can predict that a fault line will produce a major earthquake in the next decade. You cannot predict the date, the magnitude, or the epicenter. The triggers are stochastic. What is deterministic is the pressure. The pressure builds whether anyone notices it or not. And when the fault slips, it slips because the pressure was there, not because of whatever happened to be the last vibration. COVID did not cause the 2020s crisis. Trump did not cause the 2020s crisis. Social media did not cause the 2020s crisis. Those were triggers, interchangeable triggers. If it had not been COVID, it would have been something else. If it had not been Trump, it would have been a different counter-elite figure channeling the same structural frustration. The model is agnostic about triggers. What the model describes with mathematical precision is a system in which the pressure had been building for 40 years. The variables were all in the critical range, and some kind of rupture was structurally inevitable. That is a very different way of understanding the world than the one you were taught. You were taught that history is made by great men and great events, by decisions and accidents, and the unpredictable intersection of personalities and circumstances. Turchin's model does not deny that individuals matter. It says that individuals matter the way the specific grain of sand that starts an avalanche matters. It is real. It is identifiable. You can point to it after the fact. But the avalanche was going to happen regardless, because the slope was overloaded. The grain of sand is a detail. The overloaded slope is the cause. And the slope is still overloaded. Now, I promise to be honest with you about the critiques, and I will be, because the critiques are part of the story, not a footnote, a structural part. The academic establishment's response to Peter Turchin has been, to put it carefully, hostile. And the nature of the hostility reveals something important about how institutional science handles information that threatens its disciplinary boundaries. At a conference at Columbia University in 2010, titled Crossing Boundaries, Ancient History Explores Its Future, Turchin presented his framework to a room of historians. He has recounted what happened next multiple times. A visibly agitated historian burst out with the words, "But this is not history." Turchin's response, which he has repeated in interviews with what I can only describe as the weary precision of a man who has had this argument 100 times, was that he agreed. History has a humanity, which is what traditional historians do, and history as a science, which is what Cliodynamics attempts, are very different academic disciplines. The pushback was not primarily about the math being wrong. It was about the math being inappropriate. The objection was not, your model does not fit the data. The objection was, you do not get to use a model. The idea that human history could be subjected to the same kind of quantitative analysis as beetle populations was treated by many historians as a category error, as an arrogance, as, in the words of an unheard article published in May of 2024, the arrogance of scientific history. And then there is the Sechat controversy, which I need to walk through carefully because it is the single most damaging episode for the credibility of Cliodynamics, and it must be presented honestly. In 2019, a team led by Harvey Whitehouse, with Turchin as a co-author, published a paper in Nature titled Complex Societies Precede Moralizing Gods Throughout World History. The paper argued, based on Sechat data, that large-scale complex societies emerged before, not after, the development of religions featuring moralizing gods. This was a direct challenge to the big gods hypothesis, which held that belief in supernatural punishment was necessary for the evolution of large-scale cooperation. The paper was high-profile, Nature, headline-grabbing conclusions, and within months, it was under attack. In 2020, Edward Slingerland at the University of British Columbia and 15 co-authors published a detailed rebuttal accusing the Sechat team of miscoding key historical sources, particularly relating to late Shang China. Then, in 2021, Brett Boeheim and colleagues published a devastating critique demonstrating that 61% of the moralizing gods observations in the dataset were missing values that the authors had recoded as absent during analysis. In effect, the absence of evidence for moralizing gods had been treated as evidence of absence. Nature retracted the paper in July of 2021. This is a real wound. It matters, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. But here is what I need you to understand about the topology of this controversy, because the way it has been deployed in public discourse is misleading. The retracted paper was about whether complex societies preceded moralizing gods. It had nothing to do with the structural demographic prediction about American instability. The SESHAT database contains nearly 300,000 records across 600 variables. The Moralizing Gods paper used a narrow slice of that database, a slice that turned out to have serious coding problems. The structural demographic variables that drive the PSI calculation, real wages, elite numbers, debt to GDP ratios, trust in government, are drawn from entirely different data sources. Census data, Bureau of Labor Statistics reports, Federal Reserve economic data, Pew Research surveys. These are not hand-coded historical observations about Bronze Age religious practices. They are standardized economic measurements with well-documented methodologies. Conflating the Moralizing Gods retraction with a refutation of Turchin's instability prediction is like dismissing the entirety of NASA's Mars program because one of their Earth observation satellites had a faulty sensor. The instruments are different. The data is different. The conclusions are different. But the conflation has been made, repeatedly, by people who have never engaged with the structural demographic model on its own terms. And that conflation, the institutional tendency to find one procedural vulnerability and use it to dismiss an entire uncomfortable framework, is itself something the model predicts. Not because the model is unfalsifiable or because Turchin can explain away any critique, but because one of the features of a society in the disintegrative phase of a secular cycle is the degradation of intellectual institutions, the inability of established knowledge systems to absorb and respond to new information, the retreat into disciplinary boundaries, the substitution of procedural objections for substantive engagement. I am not saying the critics are wrong about the Moralizing Gods paper. They were right. The paper had serious methodological problems, and the retraction was justified. What I am saying is that the leap from this paper had coding errors to therefore this man's prediction about American instability can be dismissed is not a logical inference. It is a social one. It is the kind of inference that institutions make when they want to stop thinking about something uncomfortable. There are substantive critiques that deserve attention. The widely read economic history blogger, who writes under the name Pseudo-Erasmus, has argued that Turchin's evidence for elite fragmentation relies too heavily on the bimodal distribution of lawyer salaries and the degree of legislative polarization, and that contemporary American elites are not competing with each other so much as colluding against everyone else. The Martin Gillen's oligarchic capture model, rather than the intra-elite competition model. Turchin has responded that intra-elite competition and oligarchic capture are compatible in his framework. Both can be true simultaneously. Elites can be cooperating to extract from the productive base while simultaneously competing with each other for the limited number of positions at the very top. The frustrated counter-elite is not competing with the working class. They are competing with the established elite for control of the extraction apparatus. Compact magazine published a long critique in 2024 titled Peter Turchin's False Prophecy, arguing that the concept of elite overproduction is unstable because Turchin sometimes means the top 1%, wealth, and sometimes means the over-credentialed, professional, managerial class. This is a fair point. The definition does shift, and it matters because the policy implications are very different depending on which definition you use. Taxing the 1% is a different intervention from restricting graduate school enrollment. But again, the core prediction held. Nobody who has critiqued Turchin has offered a competing model that produced a comparably specific, comparably accurate forecast of American instability a decade in advance. The critiques nibble at the edges. They question the precision of individual indicators, the stability of definitions, the coding quality of peripheral databases. What they do not do is explain why the PSI curve, calculated from standard economic data using a mathematically explicit model, peaked exactly when and how it was predicted to peak. And nobody is trying. That, to me, is the most revealing fact in this entire story. Not that the prediction was made, not that it was confirmed, but that after it was confirmed, the primary response of the academic and political establishment was not to engage with the model, stress test it, refine it, and use it. The primary response was to treat the man who built it as a curiosity, a novelty, a magazine profile subject, the mad prophet of Connecticut. That phrase, by the way, came from the journalist Graham Wood, who wrote the Atlantic profile that made Turchin famous in December of 2020. Turchin publicly objected to the framing on his blog. He is not a prophet. He is a scientist. He does not claim to see the future. He claims to have identified structural dynamics that produce predictable outcomes. The difference matters. Prophets can be dismissed as mystics. Scientists have to be engaged with on the merits of their data. The Mad Prophet episode is worth dwelling on because it reveals something structural about how our media ecosystem processes the kind of work Turchin does. The Atlantic article by Graham Wood, published in the December 2020 print issue, under the title "The Next Decade Could Be Even Worse," was by any standard a well-reported, well-written profile. Wood spent time with Turchin. He engaged with the theory. He presented the evidence, and the piece went viral, generating millions of views and making Turchin a household name among the online, intellectually curious class. But the framing was wrong, and the framing mattered. By titling the piece as a prediction of doom, by centering Turchin as a character rather than the model as a tool, by using the word prophet, Wood inadvertently gave every critic of Cliodynamics exactly the ammunition they needed to dismiss it. Prophets are eccentric. Prophets are cranks. Prophets stand on street corners with cardboard signs. You do not build policy around prophets. The word itself activated a frame that made it psychologically easier to file Turchin's work as entertainment rather than information. Turchin recognized this immediately. On his blog, he objected to the Hari Seldon comparison, writing that the fictional psychohistory had no appreciation of nonlinear dynamics and mathematical chaos. He objected to the framing that historians had to surrender to Cliodynamics, writing that this was entirely on Graham's conscience. He was gracious about the article overall, but clearly frustrated by the way it would be received. And he was right to be frustrated. Because what happened next was exactly what you would predict if you understood how institutional immune systems work. The article made Turchin famous. And fame, in the academic world, is not always an asset. The more Turchin appeared in mainstream media, the easier it became for his academic critics to dismiss him as a popularizer rather than a scientist. The more the public framed his work as prophecy, the easier it became for historians to say that serious scholarship does not make predictions. The mechanism of dismissal was not logical, it was social, and it happened in plain sight. But engaging with the data would mean confronting what the data says. And what the data says is that the structural pressures driving American instability have not peaked, that the historical base rate for societies in analogous structural positions is 75% catastrophic outcome, that the one mechanism which has historically averted catastrophe, elite self-restraint and redistribution, requires the people benefiting most from the current system to voluntarily accept constraints on their wealth and power, and that nothing in the current political trajectory suggests that mechanism is engaging. Turchin himself is not a prophet of doom. Despite the framing, he has repeatedly emphasized that the model is probabilistic. 25% of analogous crises were resolved through reform. It is possible. He has named the specific interventions that worked historically: higher taxation on wealth, breaking up monopolistic concentrations of economic power, expanding political participation, investing in broad-based economic opportunity rather than credential-based gatekeeping. These are not radical proposals. They are the same interventions that worked in the Progressive Era and the New Deal. They are the interventions that, in Turchin's model, reset the integrative cycle and produced the post-war era of shared prosperity and political stability that lasted from the 1940s through the 1970s. But implementing them requires something that the model itself suggests may be structurally impossible at this stage of the cycle. It requires elites to act against their short-term interests in service of long-term stability. And the model says that as elite overproduction intensifies and intra-elite competition escalates, the capacity for that kind of collective action degrades. The very dynamics that make reform necessary make reform less likely. The system is in a trap. I keep coming back to the pine beetles. I keep thinking about Turchin sitting in his office in Stores, looking at 50 years of beetle outbreak data, watching the populations boom and crash, driven by the internal dynamics of the system, by the inescapable mathematics of predator-prey feedback. The beetles did not know they were in a model. They did not understand the equations governing their population. They just did what beetles do. They consumed resources, reproduced, overshot their carrying capacity, and crashed. The math described them from above. They experienced it from inside. And I think about Turchin looking at those same equations applied to human civilizations, watching the curves climb, publishing the prediction, being ignored, watching the prediction come true, being called a prophet, watching the curves keep climbing, being asked in interview after interview what happens next, and answering with the measured precision of a man who has been doing this for 30 years, that the model says the pressure is still building, that the historical odds are not in our favor, that reform is possible, but requires exactly the kind of collective action that the current structural dynamics are designed to prevent. I think about his father, Valentin Turchin, the physicist who saw the structural failures of the Soviet system, named them publicly, and was expelled for it, who died in 2010, the year his son published a paragraph in Nature predicting that a different system, the one the family had fled to, was heading toward its own structural crisis. The math that describes pine beetle population crashes and the math that describes the disintegration of complex human societies is the same math, the same equations, the same oscillations, the same pattern of overshoot and collapse. And the people who study beetle populations do not argue about whether the math is appropriate. They use it, they test it, they refine it, they build management strategies based on it. Nobody says, but this is not entomology when you apply Lotka-Volterra equations to bark beetle outbreaks. They say, what are the parameter values and does the model fit the data? When Turchin applied the same math to human history, the first response was, but this is not history. The second response, after the prediction was confirmed, was, but the database has coding errors. The third response, the one we are in now, is silence, not engagement, not testing, not refinement, not the development of management strategies based on the model's outputs. Silence, punctuated by the occasional magazine profile that treats the whole thing as an intellectual novelty rather than as a warning. 75%, 168 crises, 10,000 years, 3 out of 4 ended in violence, state collapse, or both. The model that produced this finding also produced the most accurate forecast of American instability in the modern era. The variables that drove the forecast are still accelerating. The mechanism that historically reversed the trajectory is not engaging. And the man who built the model sits in Vienna at the Complexity Science Hub, writing papers and giving interviews and watching the curves climb, the same way he used to watch beetle population graphs climb in the years before an outbreak. He knows what the curves mean. He has seen this shape before. The beetles did not believe in the equations. The populations crashed anyway. The equations do not require belief. They do not require awareness. They do not require consent. They describe what happens when the structural conditions are met, regardless of whether the population inside the system understands what is happening to it. And the structural conditions, as of today, are met. Turchin was asked by Bari Weiss on her Honestly podcast in 2024 what he would say to people who find his work depressing. He said something that I think about often. He said the model does not predict collapse. It predicts elevated probability of crisis. And the purpose of the prediction is not to resign people to fate. It is to show them the structural dynamics clearly enough that they can intervene. The earthquake analogy again. If you know the fault line is under pressure, you can reinforce the buildings. You can stock the emergency supplies. You can build the institutional shock absorbers that determine whether a quake destroys a city or is absorbed by its infrastructure. But that requires looking at the fault line. That requires taking the pressure readings seriously. That requires treating the model as information rather than novelty. And that is the part that is not happening. Peter Turchin published a paragraph in Nature in 2010 predicting American instability peaking around 2020. The prediction was confirmed. The model identifies the structural drivers. The historical database documents the outcomes. The interventions are known. They have worked before. And the response of the institutions that govern the most powerful country in the history of the world has been to ignore the prediction, dismiss the model, profile the man as a curiosity, and continue accelerating in the direction the math says leads to crisis. The equations are patient. They do not care about media cycles or political terms or quarterly earnings reports. They describe dynamics that operate on timescales of decades and centuries. And they say that the American system, as currently configured, is in the late stages of a structural demographic cycle that has repeated hundreds of times across thousands of years of recorded history. The variables are in the critical range. The pressure is building. And the question is not whether the fault will slip. The question is whether, this time, anyone will listen to the man who measured the pressure before the ground starts shaking. His father tried to warn one empire. He was exiled for it. His son tried to warn another. He was ignored. And I keep thinking about what it means that the math came from biology, because that is the detail that the title of this video highlights. And it is the detail that I think most people will dismiss as a curiosity, when in fact, it is the most important part of the entire story. Turchin did not invent a new kind of mathematics for human history. He borrowed an existing kind of mathematics from a field where it had already been tested exhaustively, refined over decades, and proven to work. The Lotka-Volterra equations have been applied to hundreds of species across thousands of studies. They are not speculative. They are not controversial. They are part of the standard toolkit of mathematical ecology. Any graduate student in population biology can write down the equations, estimate the parameters from field data, and make predictions about population dynamics that turn out to be correct within measurable error bars. The equations work. That is settled. What is unsettled, what remains furiously contested, is whether those same equations can be applied to human societies. And the source of the fury is not mathematical. Nobody has demonstrated that the equations produce incorrect predictions when applied to historical data. The fury is philosophical. It is the fury of people who believe that humans are fundamentally different from beetles, that human societies are too complex, too contingent, too influenced by free will and cultural variation and individual agency to be captured by any mathematical model, no matter how sophisticated. And I understand that objection. I do. It feels intuitively right that human history should be more complex than beetle outbreaks, that the fall of Rome should be irreducible to a set of differential equations, that the French Revolution should require something more than population dynamics to explain. But here is what I cannot get past. The model made a prediction in 2010 in Nature with specific variables and a specific date, and the prediction was correct, not roughly correct, not directionally correct, specifically correct. Every variable moved in the direction the model predicted, at approximately the rate the model predicted, peaking approximately when the model predicted. I have looked for another model that did this. A political science model, an economic model, a sociological model, any model from any discipline that produced a comparably specific, comparably accurate prediction of American instability a decade in advance. I have not found one. Not one. The economists did not see it coming. The political scientists did not see it coming. The intelligence community did not see it coming. The one person who published a specific, testable prediction in a major scientific journal, the one person who got it right, was a man who studies bark beetles. And the reason nobody listened to him is that his math came from biology. Think about what that says about the structure of our intellectual institutions. We have organized knowledge into disciplines. Biology here, history there, political science over there, economics in its own building. And the boundaries between those disciplines are not just organizational conveniences. They are enforced by hiring committees that want specialists, not generalists, by grant agencies that fund within disciplinary boundaries, by journals that send papers to reviewers in the same field, by tenure committees that ask whether the candidate has published in the right journals, the journals of their discipline. The entire architecture of academic knowledge production is designed to prevent exactly the kind of cross-disciplinary application that Turchin attempted. And when someone does cross the boundary, the response is not, "Show me your data." The response is, "This is not history." The response is, "Stay in your lane." The response is to treat the work as intellectually illegitimate because it came from the wrong department. Regardless of whether the predictions turned out to be correct, Turchin has a phrase he uses to describe what traditional history has produced in the way of understanding why societies collapse. He cites Alexander Demandet's 1984 book, The Fall of Rome, in which Demand catalogued 210 different explanations that historians have offered for the fall of the Western Roman Empire. 210, including, and Turchin loves pointing this out, both asceticism and hedonism, both Christianity and polytheism, both tyranny and anarchy. The explanations contradict each other. They cannot all be right. And yet they are all considered legitimate contributions to the historical literature. Because in traditional history, unlike in the natural sciences, there is no requirement that explanations be testable, quantitative, or mutually exclusive. Turchin's position is that this is not a feature of historical scholarship. It is a failure of it. That after centuries of debate, the field has produced 210 contradictory explanations for one of the most consequential events in Western civilization, and considers that a mark of intellectual richness rather than a sign that something has gone fundamentally wrong with the methodology. You can disagree with that position. Many historians do, vehemently. But you have to contend with the fact that the man who holds that position also produced the most accurate forecast of American political instability in the modern era. And the historians who dismiss him as arrogant have not produced a competing forecast. They have produced critiques of his definitions, critiques of his data sources, critiques of his philosophical assumptions. What they have not produced is a prediction. They have not put a date on a page and waited to see if they were right. Turchin did, and he was. I want to come back one more time to the database, to the 75% number, because I think the human brain has a tendency to hear a statistic like that, file it as that is bad, and then continue operating as if it does not apply to the situation one is currently living in. The 75% number does not feel real. It feels abstract. It is something that happened to other societies, in other centuries, under other political systems. So let me make it concrete. Of the 168 crises in Crisis DB, the ones that ended well, the 25%, share 4 characteristics that Turchin and Hoyer documented in a 2024 study from the Complexity Science Hub. First, the ruling elite recognized the structural crisis before it reached the point of violent rupture. Second, a faction within the elite, not a revolutionary faction from outside, proposed and implemented specific redistributive reforms. Third, those reforms addressed all 3 structural variables, not just one. They reduced immiseration through wage and land reforms. They reduced elite overproduction through institutional restructuring that created new positions or constrained elite entry. And they reduced fiscal distress through taxation reform that broadened the revenue base. Fourth, and most importantly, these reforms were implemented before the counter-elite faction had fully mobilized. Once the counter-elite was mobilized, once the structural demographic pressures had produced an organized opposition movement, led by frustrated elites channeling mass discontent, the window for reform began to close. The dynamics of intra-elite competition took over, and compromise became structurally harder to achieve. Now map those 4 conditions onto the present. Has the ruling elite recognized the structural crisis? Some individual members of the elite have. Warren Buffett's famous remark that there is a class war and his class is winning. Ray Dalio's work on the changing world order, which draws explicitly on cyclical models of history. Nick Hanauer's 2014 Politico essay, The Pitchforks Are Coming for Us Plutocrats, which was directly inspired by Turchin's work. These are individual voices within the elite who have recognized the pattern. But elite recognition as a class-level phenomenon, the kind of collective awareness that would translate into institutional action, there is no evidence of it. Congress has not held a single hearing on structural demographic theory. No federal agency has commissioned an analysis based on Turchin's model, the framework that produced the most accurate forecast of American instability has been completely excluded from the institutional apparatus that is supposed to manage American stability. Has a faction within the elite proposed and implemented specific redistributive reforms in the opposite direction? Since 2020, the policy trajectory has been toward further deregulation, further tax reductions for high earners, further concentration of economic power, and the active dismantlement of the institutional shock absorbers, agencies, regulatory bodies, enforcement mechanisms that were put in place during previous reform periods. The wealth pump is not being reversed, it is being upgraded. Have the reforms addressed all 3 structural variables? There are no reforms to address. Has the counter-elite faction fully mobilized? Yes, the mobilization has been underway for at least a decade and has produced a political movement that now controls the executive branch a significant portion of the judiciary, and a working majority in the legislature. The counter-elite is not at the gates. The counter-elite is in the building. And the model says that once the counter-elite is mobilized, the dynamics shift from a reform possible situation to a confrontation probable situation. I am not telling you this to frighten you. I am telling you this because the information exists. It is published, it is peer-reviewed, and it is being systematically excluded from the conversations that determine the future of the country it describes. Jack Goldstone, the political scientist, whose 1991 work provided the intellectual foundation for Turchin's model, wrote a piece for the French publication Monde D'ailleurs in 2025, in which he applied structural demographic theory to the current moment. He said, and I quote this precisely because the authority of the source matters, that the very same models that accurately explain the onset of the French Revolution of 1789 and the Arab uprisings of 2010 through 2011 also explain the MAGA revolution in the United States that is ongoing today. Goldstone is not a crank. He is a professor at George Mason University with 40 years of published work on state breakdown and revolution. He is not predicting the future. He is describing the present. And what he is describing is a structural demographic crisis in which the variables are in the critical range and the historical precedents are not encouraging. There is one more thing I need to tell you before I finish, and it is the thing I have been circling around for this entire script. The thing that makes this different from the usual America is in trouble discourse that you can find anywhere. The usual discourse treats the current crisis as a political problem, a problem of leadership, or partisanship, or media polarization, or social media, or cultural decline. And those are real factors. I am not dismissing them, but they are what Turchin would call triggers. They are the specific grain of sand that starts the avalanche. The model says the avalanche was going to happen regardless, because the slope was overloading. And the slope has been overloading for 50 years, driven by dynamics that are mathematical, structural, and largely invisible to the people living inside the system. The beetles do not understand the equations. They do not perceive the oscillation from inside it. They experience their world as a series of events, good years and bad years, abundant food and scarce food, lots of competitors and few competitors. Each beetle makes individual decisions based on local conditions. None of them has a model of the system. None of them can see the curve from above, and the curve does not need them to see it. It runs whether they understand it or not. We are not beetles. We have the capacity for self-awareness that beetles do not. We can see the curve from above if we choose to look. Turchin has drawn the curve. He has published the curve. He has explained the dynamics that produce the curve. He has identified the interventions that can flatten the curve. And he has been saying, for 15 years with increasing urgency, that the window for intervention is closing. The mathematics of population biology describes a system in which the current structural configuration of the United States of America produces political instability as a mathematical output. The same mathematics applied to 168 previous crises shows that 3/4 of them ended in violence or state collapse. The 1/4 that avoided catastrophe did so through specific, identifiable elite-led redistribution and institutional reform. None of those reforms are underway. Every structural indicator is still moving in the wrong direction. And the man who predicted all of this from a paragraph in Nature in 2010, who got it right when every other model got it wrong, who used mathematics borrowed from the study of insect population, crashes because no other discipline had built the tools to see what he was seeing. That man is sitting in the Rothschild Palace in Vienna, where the Complexity Science Hub has its offices, writing papers and giving interviews and watching the same curves he has been watching for 30 years. He knows what the curves mean. He saw the same shapes in the beetle data decades ago. The boom, the overshoot, the phase where the population is still growing but the structural conditions for the crash are already locked in. The lag between when the dynamics become mathematically inevitable and when the population actually experiences the consequences. That lag is the window, and the window, according to the man who measured it, is closing. His father saw the structural contradictions of the Soviet system from inside it, named them, was expelled for naming them, died in 2010, the year his son published a paragraph predicting that the American system was entering its own structural crisis. The math does not change because you refuse to read it. The oscillation does not stop because you look away. The populations boom. The predators multiply. The prey base declines. The surplus predators turn on each other. And the crash, when it comes, arrives on a schedule that the equations knew about all along. The equations are sitting in Nature. Volume 4, 63, page 608. They have been sitting there since February of 2010. They are still running. And nobody, not Congress, not the Federal Reserve, not the intelligence community, not the institutions whose job it is to anticipate exactly this kind of systemic crisis, has done what the model says you need to do to change the outcome. The model says you reverse the wealth pump, you tax concentrated wealth, you break up monopolies, you expand economic opportunity at the base instead of credential gating it at the top. You reduce elite overproduction by investing in paths to prosperity that do not require 6 figures of debt and a graduate degree. You restore state legitimacy by making the government visibly, measurably responsive to the needs of ordinary people instead of the donor class. These are not radical proposals. They are the proposals that worked in the 1830s in Britain, in the 1860s in Russia, in the 1930s in the United States. They are the proposals that produce the 25% outcome instead of the 75% outcome. And they are not being implemented. They are not being proposed. They are not being discussed by anyone with the power to implement them, with reference to the framework that says they are necessary. The pine beetles did not know they were in a model. The Romans did not know they were in a cycle. The French aristocrats did not know they were surplus predators in a population that had overshot its carrying capacity. They experienced their world as a series of events, each one surprising, each one unprecedented, each one demanding immediate reaction to immediate circumstances. None of them could see the curve from above. You can. The curve has been drawn. The data has been published. The math is available. The prediction was made and confirmed. The historical database has been compiled and analyzed. The interventions have been identified and documented. Everything needed to change the trajectory is sitting in the open, in journals, in books, in databases, available to anyone who cares to look. The question is not whether the model is right. The model has been tested and it works. The question is whether the civilization the model describes has the capacity to act on the information the model provides. Whether we can do what the beetles cannot. Whether we can see the curve from above, understand what it means, and choose a different path before the mathematics of structural demographic theory finishes the calculation it started in the 1970s. Turchin does not know the answer to that question. Neither do I. Neither does anyone. The model does not predict choices. It predicts pressures. It says the pressure is there. It says the pressure is building. It says the historical odds are 3 to 1 against. And the equations are still running.